Hi everyone, just wanted to start out our week talking about color because color is going to be important as you go forward and start to work on your book design layout in Illustrator. You're going to be thinking about color a little bit and probably add some color to your design. And really, you have to think about color as symbolic. You also have to think about what mood you're creating, and color can have an immense impact on mood. That's why in graphic design you always want to start out designing in gray and then strategically add color and really think deeply about what the color is communicating. We'll talk a little bit about color theory. There's two types of color models you're going to be working with as a graphic designer. The first is called additive, and the primary colors in the additive model are red, green, and blue. And notice that the secondary colors in the additive model are cyan, magenta, and yellow. And additive means that at 100% or at if you were to add the most intense saturation of all three colors, red, green, and blue, you would get pure white. Then we have subtractive. Subtractive is used in commercial printing, and that's a CMY model. And if you notice if you add these colors at the most intense capacity, you get pure black. So it's called subtractive because what color printers do is they sort of pull colors. They look at a print, and then if they need to pull a little magenta, they will, or if they need to pull a little bit of yellow or a little bit of cyan, they pull it out to get the perfect color balance, and that's why it's called subtractive. But the important thing to note is when you add all these colors together, you're going to get pure black. But in commercial printing, what's interesting is it doesn't quite work out that way. So if you added all three colors together at 100%, you get sort of a murky brown. So they then add in pure black. And so it's actually a 4-channel color model: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, because they can't get true black with the inks. So that's kind of why they have to add that 4th channel in. And in Illustrator and Photoshop, you can choose to work in either RGB mode, red, green, blue, or CMYK mode. K stands for black in the CMYK model. And we'll think about the color wheel a little bit, because as you start to work with color, you probably want to strategically think about your color scheme. So in color theory, you think about colors and their relationship to each other on this color wheel. So you have monochromatic, which would just be one color, yellow, for example, mixed with potentially gray, different shades of gray, including pure black and pure white. And then you have analogous, which is where you have colors that are really close to each other on the color wheel. So maybe yellow and green or yellow and orange would be analogous. And then you have complementary, which are colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So that might be, yellow. In this case, it would be yellow and violet would be more complementary because they're completely opposite each other on this wheel. So as we sort of look at designs, assess what is the color scheme. Is it monochromatic? In this case, this is a monochromatic color scheme. The primary hue is red, and then you have various shades of that color kind of going into pure black to pure white. This is analogous, and you can see that there's green and blue on this side and more sort of brown and orange on the other side, and those are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So this color scheme is really pleasing and used quite frequently in design, and it provides a little bit of intensity, a little bit of contrast, but it's not nearly as extreme as a complementary color scheme, and it just feels very sophisticated, kind of like the monochromatic, but just a little more kick, a little bit more energy, because the colors aren't all just one color palette. And then you have complementary, which really intense contrast is created with complementary color schemes. And then lastly, you might have a chaotic color scheme where you're pulling from all sides of the wheel, and you're not really thinking strategically about, are they close together? Are they far apart? This might be intuitive, like you just choose colors based on what you're feeling, and it quickly becomes pretty chaotic, and it can be interesting to look at, but can sort of overwhelm the design. So you sort of have to be careful about these chaotic color schemes, because they sort of take away from everything else and just make people think about the color. It's also really important to sort of think about what the colors mean. And the color meaning can change depending on what culture you're in, what part of the world you live in, and also the context that you're using the color in. So in the West, these are kind of some color associations. So white is usually sort of seen as a pure color. Notice that in the West, brides are usually married in white. Yellow can be a color that signifies warmth. It can also be sort of a more natural color palette or a more organic color palette. Red can be intense. It can symbolize blood or violence in the West, but in other cultures, brides might be married in red, so that might signify more purity. Purple is a prestigious color in the West. We think about nobility. Kings were also associated with this vibrant color. And it's a color that you don't see very often in nature. So it's somewhat rare in nature, which makes it sort of special. Blue, peaceful, tranquil, stable. If you notice in logo design, a lot of times blue will be used to signify stability. And so you can see blue logos, for example, with banks or with companies that really want to stress that they're stable and that they are, trying to project that in terms of their identity. Green symbolizes nature. So, for example, the recycling logo is always, usually green. Brown, very earth-based. It's genuine. It's a genuine color. It can also be sort of sad or wistful. Black is a power color. Priests wear black to signify submission to God. It can be kind of thought of as an authoritarian color. And so color and mood, sometimes you want harmony and sometimes you want tension. So you have to think about that. Colors close to each other on the color wheel create harmony, and colors opposite each other on the color wheel create tension. And so let's just look at some designs and think strategically, what did they do? So if you look at the background here, it's a monochromatic color scheme, but then they added in these sort of graphical elements and they were very kind of more playful in their color scheme. The red is more of a complementary color where there's more tension, there's more contrast, and then they have a few other colors sort of in here on this little corner with these dots. And notice the text alignment, everything's beautifully aligned. They probably used a grid to create this design. Color can create sort of emphasis. So if you notice here, you're looking at this word inside because it is sort of standing out and it's creating contrast from the background. And then this is really beautiful, in my opinion, the way they sort of saturated. They probably took this image and they completely desaturated and then they brought in colors to create this effect. And so it's very monochromatic with orange sort of being the primary color mixed in with a lot of gray and more neutral colors. Legibility. It's important to provide significant contrast between type and its background. So that's, as typographers, we're going to be thinking in terms of type. And so you might pick a color that you think really signifies or is communicating something, but then your other goal is to really think about that legibility and if the color is taking away from the legibility, then that's something that you might need to address. Look at this middle square here and notice that the blue and the green is not a great color combination because the text is sort of disappearing and it's really hard to see. Whereas the one right below it with the yellow and the dark brown sort of popping out, really visible, really easy to see. And you can use percentages of color that are close to create sort of a nice background texture effect. So this is an example of that where you sort of have this taxi and it's semi-transparent and it's against this dark background and it's there, but it's not like screaming at us. And then you have this type on top that's white, that's standing out, that's creating that contrast. Here's a great example of color as emphasis. And you can notice strategically what the designer did here is they created this beautiful red here. I'm sort of looking at it and kind of captivated by this red fish. And even though this fish is the same size as all the other fish, it really stands out and sort of pulls my gaze. And then what the designer did on the bottom is they put a tiny bit of the same color in the type so that it would pull me down and create sort of a sense of balance in the design. A monochromatic color scheme, very sophisticated, but there's also quite a bit of contrast here because of the range. So you have almost pure black in this image, and then you have the white text sort of creates contrast, and it's kind of standing out and really visible. And you notice with these posters, let me zoom out just a little bit here so you can see them. There's going to be a series of posters here, different color schemes being tried. And what I really recommend is that you do comparing and contrasting. So don't just tweak your color scheme and keep tweaking it, keep looking at it. Commit to a color scheme, design your book cover in it, and then save it, and then commit to another color scheme, create another design, and then compare and contrast. It's really important that you compare and contrast and don't just keep making changes to your work, because if you don't compare and contrast, you're never going to know what the best solution is. You're just going to constantly change, and you're going to forget what it looked like before. So look at this design. This is sort of a collection of warm and cool grays. It feels more urban, and this palette might attract more modern urbanites. Here, it's more deeply saturated dyes and pigments, and the idea was that these dyes and pigments might be used by cultures around the world, so it's kind of this more world beat. The color scheme sort of might reach a more diverse audience, and that's kind of the goal here. Then you have natural. It doesn't exude the same energy as the previous color scheme. It's more restrained, has a more organic feel, more down to earth, and it might just be better for an audience that was a little bit more sophisticated, maybe a little bit more older, so that they weren't needing that intensity as much. So as you design your book, I want you to really strategically think about that color scheme that you're using. And a lot of times you would even put the number of the color next to it so that if you were to share your color scheme with another designer, perhaps working on your team, or you're going to hand over your design files eventually to someone else, maybe it's the client, then you would want to really be specific about what colors you used. And in your book designs, I want you to have a reason for using whatever color you choose. So really think strategically about that. And it's really great to sort of lay out a palette for yourself so that you can see the colors next to each other and then start strategically adding them to the design. Gray and black are great color, great to add to any palette. So they go beautifully with almost every color. So you really can deepen the contrast or create a beautiful sort of more subtle shift in contrast by adding in sort of a dark gray or even a light gray or more neutral color with a intense color like red, for example. I love this color scheme, and notice the complementary colors, red and blue here, sort of paired with the black, and there's this beautiful texture behind this design. This would be an example. So notice this graphic here, I guess it's a dress, and then that's a beautiful example of masking, where there's an image sort of masked inside of that simple illustration. Also notice the fonts being used here and how you're going to strategically sort of think about your font layout, and then you're also going to think about your color. And if you're using images, like let's say you have a cityscape in your design and you're using a full color image that you took maybe from the web, for example, because you can appropriate images for this design, you probably want to desaturate it and then add color back in. So I can show you how to do that in Illustrator. It's really easy. You can sort of add in color to a desaturated image, make it look really beautiful, and then add it to your design. Okay, we're noticing the red here. That's sort of the primary focal point. And then in the background, you're getting that complementary color. And then also black added in, a little bit of blue here. And even if you have a full color photograph, think about the palette, what colors are being used. And gray, don't discount gray. Beautiful designs are done in all gray palettes. So if you want to use gray, that's perfectly acceptable. And it can probably work well for almost any design. A grayscale color scheme should look good before you add color in. And sometimes it's the best choice for the final design. So we're going to keep going with this. You're going to design your book covers. You're going to think about color. And if I ask you what color, why did you choose that specific color? Have a reason for me. Think, is it symbolic? Is it creating contrast? Are you using a monochromatic color scheme, a complementary color scheme, an analogous color scheme, or a chaotic color scheme? Are you strategically using two colors that have sort of a symbolic meaning? So really think about that as you design and be prepared to sort of give an explanation for why you chose a specific color scheme.